Picture a school cafeteria for a second. You know, you've got the classic plastic tray, the little cardboard carton of milk.
Yeah, maybe a scoop of green beans on the side.
Right. And whatever the main dish happens to be on a Tuesday. And usually when we think about that tray, we view it strictly through a very specific lens.
Exactly. It's almost universally framed as a nutritional intervention, right? The whole goal is just to support learning and, childhood development.
Like getting calories into kids so they can actually pay attention in math class instead of just staring at the clock.
Right, exactly.
But what if I told you that that exact same plastic lunch tray is actually one of the most powerful and honestly, arguably, the most misunderstood macroeconomic engines on the planet?
It really is a massive perspective shift because when you take that single lunch tray and you scale it up to an entire country or, a whole hemisphere, you are suddenly looking at gigantic public procurement contracts.
Huge amounts of money.
Right. You're looking at policies that can entirely reshape local labor markets.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with this massive kind of invisible reallocation of household wealth.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are doing a deep dive into a really comprehensive 2026 bachelor's thesis. It's by a researcher named Hiskia Pandya Bagaswara Ardia from IPB University.
And it's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. This researcher did something incredible. They pulled together 55 different Scopus Index studies published all over the world between 2016 and 2026.
So we have a decade of solid data.
Right. And our mission today is to figure out how these massive financial interventions actually impact local economies, farms, and families. But before we go any further, just a quick note for you listening. School lunches and public spending are obviously heavily debated political topics.
Oh, absolutely.
So today, we aren't taking any sides or endorsing any specific political viewpoints. We are simply acting as your guides, looking impartially at the economic data presented in this research, just to understand what the numbers actually say.
And crucially, we're going to take a very hard look at the reliability of the evidence that policymakers actually use to make those decisions.
Because it's not all created equal.
Not at all. As this thesis reveals, while school meals represent just a colossal amount of global public spending, the evidence for how they work and, who actually benefits economically is incredibly fragmented.
Yeah.
The central tension we are going to explore today is that the economic justifications politicians love to talk about the most are, well, they're often supported by the weakest possible data.
Which is wild to think about.
Good.
I mean, so let's get into it. But before we get to the actual money and the impact, we have to understand how we know what we know.
Right, the methodology.
Yeah, because you were telling me earlier that evaluating global school meal programs is just a massive methodological headache. Like, why is it so hard for researchers to just look at a spreadsheet and say, yes, this program boosts the economy, or no, it doesn't?
Well, it comes down to a core problem that the thesis refers to as, and this is a bit of a mouthful, metric incommensurability.
Okay, stop right there. Metric incommensurability.
Mm.
I'm going to need you to put that in plain English for us.
I know, it sounds dense. It simply means that you have a bunch of researchers studying the exact same topic, school meals, but they are measuring completely different things using completely different yardsticks.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. So, for example, you might have a research team in Kenya, and they are looking at local economic multipliers. They want to know, if the government spends $1 on school food, how does that dollar cascade through the local farming economy?
Like, does it turn into $2 of local wealth?
Exactly, tracking the cash. But then you look at a study from Grenada, and they are measuring something entirely different. They're using a Kakwani index.
Okay, I'm definitely going to need you to define that one too.
Fair enough.
Right.
A Kakwani index is a specific mathematical way to measure if a government policy is making economic inequality better or worse. It measures the progressivity of a benefit. So they aren't looking at local farm wealth at all. They are strictly looking at the wealth gap.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have researchers in China measuring the percentage point increase in mothers getting jobs off the farm. And then in Ghana, they are calculating something called learning adjusted years of schooling.
Okay, I see the problem. It is like trying to calculate a combined overall score for an Olympic decathlon, but the only tool you have is a stopwatch.
That is exactly it.
Like, you can perfectly time how fast someone ran the 100-meter dash, but you can't use seconds to measure how many pounds someone lifted or, how high they jumped in the pole vault. You literally cannot combine those numbers.
That is a perfect analogy. You just cannot take those wildly different metrics and pool them into a traditional meta-analysis. If you try to mathematically average a Kakwani inequality index with a maternal labor percentage, you get a number that means absolutely nothing.
Right, it's just mathematical nonsense.
Exactly.
So if we can't do the traditional math and just crunch the raw numbers together, how does this thesis actually solve the problem? How did the researcher get a global picture of what is going on?
They used a fascinating methodology called meta-aggregation, and they graded the evidence using something called the Conqual approach.
Meta-aggregation.
Right. So instead of trying to pool the raw data points, the researcher extracts the actual finding statements from the studies.
Wait, what does that look like in practice? Give me an example of aggregating a finding statement.
Sure. Instead of pulling the spreadsheet numbers, you pull the written conclusion. So, for example, a sentence like, implementing universal free meals increased maternal employment.
Okay, just the text itself.
Right. You take that written finding, along with the evidence the original authors used to support it, and you group it with similar findings from other studies. Then, instead of running a statistical average, you grade that aggregated finding on two specific criteria.
Which are?
Dependability and credibility.
Dependability and credibility, meaning, like, how robust was the actual research design and how clearly does the data actually support the conclusion the authors wrote down?
Precisely. You evaluate whether the author's claims match their evidence and whether the finding holds up across different contexts.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and you end up with a synthesized finding that gets a plain text grade. High, moderate, low, or very low. It allows you to compare the overall strength of the evidence across different countries, even if the underlying numbers are totally different.
That's super clever.
It is. And what is fascinating about this approach is that it reveals a massive hidden bias in the literature itself. The region a study comes from almost entirely dictates the methodology used.
Well, this was one of the most interesting parts of the paper for me. Break down how the regions differ.
Well, let's look at the United States. In the U.S., researchers have access to incredible, highly detailed retail data. So, U.S. studies heavily rely on scanner panel data.
Like literal grocery store barcodes.
Yes, exactly. They track barcode scans at the store to see exactly how household shopping changes when a school meal program is introduced. And to analyze that, they use difference in differences designs.
Okay, for those of us who aren't data scientists, explain difference in differences.
Imagine you have two neighboring counties. County A starts offering free school meals, County B doesn't. A difference in differences design tracks the grocery spending in both counties over time.
So County B is like the control group.
Right. It looks at the difference in spending before the program started and compares it to the difference after. It is a way to isolate the impact of the school meal by controlling for general trends, like inflation, that affect both counties equally.
Got it. So the U.S. uses grocery barcodes and county comparisons. What about other places?
In Brazil, the focus is entirely different because they have constitutional mandates about buying school food from family farms. So Brazilian studies use regression discontinuity design.
Regression discontinuity. And what is the mechanism behind that?
It is a way to measure impact by looking at an arbitrary cutoff rule. Let's say a government policy mandates extra funding, but only for municipalities with fewer than 50,000 residents. Researchers will compare a town with 4,999 residents to a town with 5,001 residents. Those towns are practically identical in every way, same geography, same culture, but one barely gets the funding and one barely misses it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it isolates the exact economic impact of that specific policy cutoff.
That is brilliant. It creates a natural experiment out of thin air.
Mm-hmm.
And then what about the data out of China?
In China, the literature is dominated by studies looking at the staggered rollout of national nutrition programs. They use something called instrumental variables.
Which is what exactly?
Because you can't always run a clean experiment, researchers find a quirky external variable like the specific, seemingly random date a program was launched in a specific province to isolate just the effect of the program from everything else going on in the economy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Oh, and notably, the thesis points out there are 0 studies from Southeast Asia in this entire corpus.
Which is a huge blind spot.
Yeah.
But it means when we look at the results, we have to constantly remember for you listening that geography and methodology are deeply tangled together here.
Always.
Okay, so now that we understand the grading system and the methods, let's get into the actual real-world impacts. if we can't reliably prove these things perfectly everywhere, what do we know? Let's start with the supply side. The food itself.
Right, the agricultural procurement pathway.
Yeah, because if you watch the news, the most frequently repeated justification for school meals, aside from the obvious benefit of feeding hungry kids, of
Yeah.
course, is that it boosts the regional economy. You hear it all the time from local leaders, right?
Oh, constantly.
We are going to buy local and we are going to support our farmers. But when I looked at the data in this thesis, the gap in the findings is just staggering.
It really is. It's a huge spread.
Because we have data from Louisiana, where researchers found that every dollar spent locally on school food generated just 48 cents in extra economic output. So a relatively modest economic bump.
Right.
But then you flip over to a study looking at programs in Kenya, they found a massive 2.26 multiplier. Every shilling spent generated an extra 1.2 shillings in the participating counties. Plus, it spilled over and generated 0.24 shillings in neighboring counties that didn't even implement the program. That is a night and day difference, a massive economic engine versus a tiny bump. Why are those numbers so incredibly far apart?
This is where you have to look under the hood at the modeling assumptions that researchers are making. If you connect this to the bigger picture of how money actually moves through an economy, you have to ask a fundamental question. Is the money the school is spending new money, or is it just moved money?
Break that down. Explain the difference.
Well, let's say a school decides to buy all its apples from Farmer Joe down the road. In some economic models, the researcher assumes that apple purchase is purely additive. They assume Farmer Joe just got a huge boost in new income.
Because the school bought his apples.
Right. But in reality, maybe the school just displaced existing sales. If Farmer Joe was going to sell those exact same apples to the local grocery store anyway, the net economic gain to the region is much, much smaller. The apples just went to a cafeteria instead of a supermarket.
Ah. So the Louisiana study might be aggressively accounting for that displacement. Like saying, hey, this isn't a magical new revenue stream, it's just a shift in buyers, which makes the multiplier look a lot smaller.
Exactly. And there is another major mechanism at play here, which is labor. Do you include the wages of the local cafeteria staff in your economic model?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, some studies attribute the bulk of their massive economic multiplier to the fact that you are paying local people to cook and serve the food. Those workers then take their paychecks and spend them at local businesses.
Right, which boosts the whole town.
But other models strictly look at the agricultural supply chain, just the farmers and truck drivers, and they completely ignore the kitchen labor.
So because of these totally untested underlying assumptions that completely change from study to study, the thesis gives this buy local multiplier evidence a grade of low reliability.
It has to be downgraded. I mean, you have findings that are totally credible on their own terms in their own specific towns, but their dependability across different contexts is very weak because the baseline assumptions about displacement and labor are so different.
Okay, but what if a government doesn't just encourage buying local, but legally mandates it? What about policies that explicitly force schools to buy from small family-run farms? Brazil is famous for this, right? They have the PNAE program.
Yes, the National School Feeding Program in Brazil. It has a strict quota for buying from family farms, but the evidence here is also really sobering.
Why? What did they find?
Researchers looked at all 5,570 Brazilian municipalities. They found that a legal mandate to buy from family farms absolutely fails unless you have prerequisite institutional capacity.
Meaning you can't just pass a law saying buy local and expect the logistics to magically solve themselves. What is the actual mechanism making it fail?
It is the bureaucracy of government contracting. Think about a small, rural farmer. Suddenly, the local school wants to buy their carrots.
Sounds great for the farmer.
Sure. But to legally sell to the government, that farmer needs to be formally registered. They need a specific tax ID. They need to meet strict health codes. They might need a refrigerated truck to deliver the food safely.
Yeah.
If the government doesn't provide technical assistance and access to finance to help that farmer upgrade their operation, they just cannot participate.
And what happens to them?
That is the tragic part. Studies found that without that support infrastructure, these mandates don't raise producer income. In fact, it can have negative effects on the weakest, most disadvantaged producers.
Because they get squeezed out.
Exactly. The larger, slightly more corporate farms figure out the paperwork and swoop in to take the contracts, while the truly small family farms get locked out of their own local market.
Which brings us to an incredible irony for you listening. The justification most frequently invoked by public officials for expanding school meals is local agricultural procurement. We are going to enrich our local family farms. Yet, according to this comprehensive review, that specific claim rests on the weakest graded evidence in the entire literature.
It attains a low confidence grade. To be clear, it doesn't mean the local economic benefits don't exist. It just means our current scientific ability to reliably measure them and guarantee them across different contexts is very weak.
Okay, so if we can't reliably prove that these meals are saving local farms, we have to follow the food. Let's look at the people actually eating it. If the supply side evidence is murky, where is the strong evidence? Where is the rock-solid proof that school meals change economies?
For that, we have to completely flip our perspective. We move away from the farms supplying the food, and we look at the households receiving it. This is where we find the only high-grade evidence in the entire thesis.
And here's where it gets really fascinating. Because the single most proven economic impact of a school lunch program has almost nothing to do with farms and everything to do with mothers.
That is exactly right. The most robust evidence centers on maternal labor supply and intra-household bargaining power. Yeah, this evidence escapes any downgrade on credibility or dependability because it is backed by very strong independent studies using those advanced research designs we talked about earlier, like instrumental variables with rigorous falsification tests to prove the causality.
Okay, so let's dive into the Chinese context, because a lot of this data originates there. We see data showing that providing free school lunches led to a 4.25 percentage point rise in maternal labor force participation.
And we have to look at the mechanism there. That effect was heavily concentrated among less educated mothers who were able to move into informal off-farm work.
Because they finally had the time.
Right. When a government provides a meal at school, they aren't just putting calories into a child, they're implicitly subsidizing the mother's caregiving time. They are freeing up hours in the middle of her day that used to be spent preparing a hot meal or returning home from the fields to feed the child.
And it goes beyond just getting a job. The research shows that this shift reduces maternal housework, it raises a woman's decision-making power within the home, and it actually shifts the entire household's consumption toward goods that are prioritized by women.
It literally alters the economic balance of power within the family structure.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Does freeing up a mother's time automatically lead to a job and economic empowerment in every single culture? Like, is this just a universal law of economics now?
It is a vital question, and the answer is no. The literature provides a fascinating structural moderator that changes the outcome.
Okay.
The effect is highly conditional on the family structure. In that same Chinese context, researchers found that this maternal labor effect completely vanishes in multi-generational households.
Because if the grandparents live in the same house...
Exactly. The grandparents just absorb the freed-up caregiving time. The mother's labor participation doesn't change at all because the household structure already had a built-in traditional mechanism for childcare. It shows that context and cultural structure dictate the economic outcome.
Okay, so freeing up time is one massive factor. But school meals are also literally free food. It's a financial transfer. How do families react to that financial windfall?
They treat it exactly like an implicit cash subsidy. Studies tracking grocery data found that when households are exposed to universal free school meals, they actively reduce their own grocery spending by about 6%.
So they take the money they were going to spend on the kids' lunch and they spend it elsewhere.
Yep.
It's like corporate budgets. Like if your company suddenly announces they are paying for your daily morning coffee, you don't start drinking twice as much coffee. You just take your personal coffee budget and you spend it on something else, which is great for your wallet. But maybe it doesn't give you the double caffeine boost the company intended.
That is the perfect analogy to explain what researchers call the intra-household flypaper effect. This is one of the most crucial findings in the thesis.
The flypaper effect?
Yeah.
That is such a vivid term. Explain the mechanism there.
Well, in traditional economics, the flypaper effect usually means money sticks where it hits.
Like if the federal government gives a city money for roads, the city spends it on roads.
Right. But inside a household, researchers found the exact opposite happens. They looked at a massive nutritional intervention in northwestern China. The government provided highly nutritious meals at school meals designed to drastically improve dietary diversity with meats and fresh vegetables.
Okay.
But the parents effectively clawed back that benefit at home.
Wait, how do they claw back? Are they just like not feeding their kids dinner?
No, it isn't malice. It is household optimization. The parents implicitly factored the high-quality school lunch into the daily household budget.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. They figured, okay, little Jimmy got a great portion of protein and eggs at school today, so at dinner, we can give the meat to Jimmy's older brother who has been working in the fields all day, and Jimmy can just have starches.
Wow.
Yeah, they reallocate the high-quality food away from the targeted child to other family members.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, from the parents' perspective, they are maximizing the health of the entire family unit. But from a policy perspective, the government thinks it is buying Jimmy a 100% nutritional boost. So what is the actual net gain for the child?
Because of that parental reallocation, the nutritional gains the children got at school were eroded by more than 70% at home.
70%.
Yeah. The net gain in the children's hemoglobin levels was just a fraction of what the policy designers intended.
That raises such a huge question about how we evaluate the success of these programs. The time and budget reallocation by the parents creates a massive overall economic benefit for the family unit, but it heavily diminishes the targeted health benefit for the specific child.
Exactly. The intended target and the actual beneficiary are two completely different things.
Okay, so we've seen the immediate impacts. The supply side impacts on farms are murky, and the impacts on household budgets and maternal labor are highly reliable. Let's look at the long game now. Do these programs actually build long-term human capital? Like, are these kids doing better in life because they got a free lunch?
There is solid evidence for long-term gains. Researchers looking at long-term data found cognitive and earning gains from childhood exposure to school meals. But again, the mechanism isn't just food equals brain power.
Right, because there's a huge caveat here that totally rethinks the value proposition. We have data from Ghana where researchers broke down the actual mathematical value of a school meal program. They calculated the educational gains, converting them into learning-adjusted years of schooling, and then they added in the distributional financial benefits to the families.
And their conclusion forces us to completely reevaluate why these programs matter in the first place. They found that up to 50% of the total benefit of the program actually derives from the social protection transfer itself.
Meaning half the value of the program is just the sheer financial relief it provides to the family budget.
Exactly. Half the value is not the educational improvements. It is not the nutritional improvements. It is simply the fact that the government took a massive financial burden off the parents' shoulders.
Half the value is just the fact that it functions as a hidden welfare check. That changes the entire math on whether a program is working. But the thesis also highlights how easily these programs can go completely off the rails if the system isn't managed well.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the actual rules governing these massive public contracts, the governance can enlarge these benefits or entirely reverse them.
Governance is the ultimate moderator. It doesn't matter how good the food is or how much it helps mothers if the underlying contracting system is broken. Let's look at a really stark example from South Africa.
Okay.
Researchers studied a policy in the Gauteng province. The government wanted to spread the economic benefits of cooking the school meals to as many people as possible, so they forced a one-year non-renewable contract rotation for the local food handlers.
So you get a job cooking the school food, but you can only do it for exactly 1 year, and then you are legally forced to give the job to someone else in the community.
I mean, it sounds fair on paper if you were trying to share the wealth. On paper, yes. In reality, it was an economic disaster. The policy resulted in 83% of those food handlers becoming completely unemployed after their 1 year was up.
83%. Why? What was the mechanism that made it fail so badly?
Because the policy treated the jobs purely as a temporary welfare distribution rather than a mechanism for skill building. 1 year is just not enough time to build a resume, save capital, or establish an independent catering business.
Right, you're just a temp.
Yeah. The government just interrupted these workers' lives, gave them a temporary wage, and then legally banned them from continuing spitting them back out with no long-term integration into the broader labor market. A policy specifically designed to reduce poverty accidentally created a brutal cycle of structural unemployment.
Good intentions, terrible governance. But governance can also work the other way, right? If done well, it can actually fix broken markets.
Absolutely. Look at the data regarding U.S. beef suppliers for the National School Lunch Program. The government imposed strict, outcome-based food safety standards. They essentially said, we are going to randomly test your beef for salmonella, and if you fail, you lose the contract.
And how did the market react to that?
It functioned as an incredibly effective quality signal. The mechanism was market restructuring. The bad suppliers, the ones who secretly knew they had sloppy safety protocols, just self-selected out.
Oh, they didn't even try.
Right. They knew they would fail the random test, so that they didn't even bother bidding for the contracts. As a result, the active suppliers who remained performed 47 to 49 percentage points better on random salmonella testing than the general market.
That's incredible.
The strict regulation didn't just punish bad behavior, it fundamentally reorganized the market to favor high-quality producers.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of all this data? Let's synthesize the journey we've been on today. We started by looking at the incredibly tricky methodology of evaluating these programs. We learned that we have to aggregate written findings because we literally cannot pool the math of Kakwani inequality indices and local farm multipliers.
And we saw that the geographic region essentially dictates the research method, which makes comparing a program in Brazil to a program in China very, very difficult.
Then we discovered that the heavily promoted buy local farming impacts, the political idea that school lunches will save the regional agricultural economy, actually rests on surprisingly low-grade evidence and is totally dependent on untested assumptions about displaced grocery sales and bureaucratic hurdles.
And we learned that the most rock-solid, scientifically proven economic impact of a school lunch is actually its ability to put mothers into the workforce, alter the balance of power in the home, and act as a hidden cash subsidy through the intra-household flypaper effect, where parents reallocate resources to optimize the family's survival.
It is just a fascinating look at how human behavior reacts to public policy.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, if we connect all this evidence to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a final paradigm shift to ponder.
Oh, what's that?
Well, the most rigorously proven economic benefit of a school lunch is the caregiving time it frees up for mothers, allowing them to commute and enter the workforce. But if we look at the world today, the fundamental nature of work is changing.
Oh, that is a really great point.
Right. With the massive rise of remote work, what happens to that economic equation? If a mother is no longer commuting to a factory or farm, but is instead working from her own kitchen table, does that freed up caregiving time still translate to the exact same level of economic empowerment and intra-household bargaining power?
Wow. Yeah.
Or does the shift toward work from home mean the entire macroeconomic math of the school lunch program is going to have to be completely recalculated all over again?
That completely changes how you look at the future of these programs.
Mm.
I mean, the humble plastic lunch tray isn't just a scoop of green beans. It is a lever that shifts household power dynamics, alters labor markets, and acts as a massive, invisible economic engine.
The tray is just the delivery mechanism. The real impact is what happens when the child brings that invisible subsidy home.
Definitely something to chew on the next time you hear a local politician talking about the cafeteria menu.